Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're diving into a foundational historical event that, well, almost everyone thinks they know. But it's actually layered with some pretty hidden, gritty realities. We're talking about the Maccabean Revolt. For over 2 millennia, this story has been passed down as a really straightforward tale of good versus evil, right? A small band of pious rebels overthrowing a massive, oppressive empire. It's literally the historical bedrock for the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. But when historians actually peel back the layers of ancient texts, political motivations, and economic records, a completely different picture starts to emerge.
Okay, let's dive right into this, because honestly, this is where history gets incredibly interesting. We are going to challenge the traditional assumptions about this conflict today. For centuries, the popular narrative has been that an evil empire just arbitrarily attacked a pure religion. But modern scholarship, when analyzing sources ranging from the books of the Maccabees all the way to the writings of the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, forces us to ask a tough question. Was this really an unprovoked religious persecution, or was it actually a bloody civil war over taxes, political power, and the high priesthood, which then just spiraled completely out of control?
So here's how we're going to untangle this complex knot today. 1. The traditional narrative. 2. Taxes and civil war. 3. The truth about the edict. 4. The Battle of Emmaus. 5. The Hasmonean kingdom. And 6. History written by victors.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the traditional narrative.
If you look at the foundational texts, particularly 1 and 2 Maccabees, the timeline goes a little something like this. Back in 168 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes launches this massive, totally unprovoked campaign of repression against the Jewish religion in Judea. A Jewish priest named Mattathias violently refuses to sacrifice to a Greek idol, which sparks a rebellion. His sons, known as the Maccabees, led most famously by Judas Maccabeus, take to the hills. And after years of gritty guerrilla warfare, Judas miraculously retakes Jerusalem in 164 BCE. He cleanses the temple, rededicates the altar, and boom! That gives us the festival of Hanukkah. It's a beautiful, powerful story of religious resistance. But is it the whole truth?
Which brings us to Section 2, taxes and civil war.
And this brilliantly illustrates the divide. You see, the traditional view frames this strictly as Judaism versus Hellenism, a grand clash of cultures. But the scholarly view, drawn from a really deep analysis of those same ancient texts, reveals that the initial spark wasn't some foreign invasion of culture at all. It was actually an internal Jewish civil war. It all started with a bitter power struggle over the high priesthood between factions led by figures like Jason and Menelaus. Jason essentially bribed the Seleucid king with the promise of higher tax revenues just to become high priest, and in return, he got permission to establish a Greek-style gymnasium right in Jerusalem, basically creating a Greek polis or city within the city. As you can imagine, this absolutely infuriated the traditionalist priesthood.
This completely reveals how ancient authors weaponized language. Take the term Hellenism, which we usually just translate as Hellenism or Greek culture. It was actually coined in the book of 2 Maccabees, but to the author of that book, it specifically meant the wicked, corrupt social order established by Jason when he founded that gymnasium. It was a highly targeted political insult aimed at a rival Jewish faction, not just some blanket rejection of everything Greek. Talk about a massive shift in perspective, right?
Moving right along to Section 3, the truth about the edict.
So, we have to look impartially at what the scholarly consensus actually is here. Historians point out that Hellenistic kings almost never attacked local cults unprovoked. I mean, it was just terrible for business and empire stability. As historians like Sylvie Honigman point out, the decree was likely severely distorted by popular memory. What probably happened was that Antiochus was away fighting a war down in Egypt. Back in Jerusalem, that civil war we just talked about between Jason and Menelaus suddenly erupted. Antiochus heard about all the violence and mistakenly believed that Judea was in full-scale rebellion against his empire.
Well, when Antiochus returned, he absolutely dropped the hammer. He implemented incredibly severe restrictions, banning circumcision, halting Sabbath observations, and intentionally polluting the temple with pig sacrifices. Now, while undeniably horrific, modern scholars argue that these were not acts of arbitrary religious zealotry. They were calculated political punishments. It was basically a form of brutal martial law, designed to break the cultural unity and rebellious spirit of a population that he believed was committing outright treason. The religion was targeted because it was the unifying force of the rebellion, brutally effective in the short term, but ultimately a massive miscalculation.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds. The Battle of Emmaus.
Just look at the sheer asymmetry of this fight for a second. In September 1655 BCE, you've got Judas Maccabeus leading a highly motivated but vastly outnumbered rebel force of about 3,000 troops. And against them, a professional Seleucid expeditionary force of 10,000 to 15,000 troops led by top-tier generals Gorgias and Nicanor. Grounding these grand historical theories in human reality, this was a literal life-or-death struggle where the Maccabees were totally expected to be completely annihilated.
Now, what's really interesting about this strategy is Judas knew he couldn't win a pitched battle, so he utilized his brilliant knowledge of the local terrain. While the Greek general Gorgias took a detachment up into the hills to hunt the rebels, Judas actually marched his men through the night, bypassed Gorgias entirely, and launched a devastating surprise attack on the main Seleucid base camp. The rebels routed the remaining forces and looted the camp for highly valuable military equipment and weapons. This incredible tactical victory didn't just boost morale, it literally armed the rebellion for the entire next phase of the war.
Let's pan out to the macro level for Section 5, the Hasmonean Kingdom.
If we follow this timeline, it's pretty wild to see how a rapid guerrilla movement evolved into a fully independent sovereign state. After the repression in 68 and that massive victory at Emmaus in 165, the Seleucids actually eventually unbanned Judaism. But the Maccabees, they just kept fighting for total political independence. Judas tragically died in battle in 160 BCE, but his brothers carried the torch. Finally, in 141 BCE, his brother Simon expelled the very last Greek garrison from Jerusalem.
So the Maccabees, who are now officially known as the Hasmonean dynasty, had established an independent state. But as you know, ruling is very different from rebelling. This newly formed dynasty had to immediately legitimize itself politically and economically in the shadow of a crumbling Seleucid empire. They navigated this great power world through savvy diplomatic alliances with places like the rising Roman Republic. They built massive military architecture to secure their borders, and crucially, they began minting their own autonomous coins, which was really the ultimate symbol of ancient statehood and economic independence.
So, the crucial point is right here in Section 6, History Written by Victors.
Remember how they weaponized the term Hellenismos? Well, they did the exact same thing with their own identity. The term Judaismos, which is where we get the word Judaism, was used in these texts not just as some broad religious identifier, but politically. It was intentionally framed to mean the specific, pious social order established by Judah Maccabee, and by extension, the exact order by which the new Hasmonean kings ruled. Basically, to be a good follower of the religion, according to these texts, meant being a loyal subject to the Hasmonean dynasty.
And this is where modern scholarship really shifts our perspective, because texts like 1 and 2 Maccabees, they brilliantly serve as dynastic history and political propaganda. By constructing a narrative that focuses heavily on a unified external threat, the quote-unquote evil Greeks, it legitimizes the Maccabees as the sole, divinely ordained saviors of the nation. But more importantly, it helps cover up a very uncomfortable truth. The Maccabees were not actually from the traditional Zadokite line of high priests. Technically speaking, they were usurpers. They absolutely needed a powerful, unifying historical narrative to justify to the people why they now held all the religious and political power.
Which leaves us with a truly fascinating, layered tapestry of history. We started today with a simple, familiar story of a miracle and religious freedom, and we uncovered a gritty, complex reality of civil war, taxes, brilliant military tactics, and state building. But it all culminates in this provocative question. If one of our most foundational historical narratives was so heavily shaped and utilized by the Maccabees to legitimize their own political dynasty, how much of the rest of our ancient history is actually just successful political propaganda? Definitely something to think about next time you read a history book. Thanks for watching The Explainer, and we'll catch you next time.